Hello, and welcome to Daily Life, Religion, and Travel Safety in Cuba. I'm your instructor, Jenny Desmond, and this is part of a 7-part series called Curious About Cuba. And in this section, in as part of the topics we'll cover, we also talk about money and what to pack and just some of the nitty-gritty details that people often have questions about. All right, let's dive in. So daily life. The revolution is really not something seen as happening in the 50s in Cuba. Rather, it's a synonym for patriotism. So patriotism equals defending the revolution in Cuba. The CDR is Comité de Defensa de la Revolución, and you find a CDR, they're more or less like a block captain that lives in your neighborhood. And so often you'll see these signs, this symbol, if you watch for it, but it can be subtle. And there are a lot of purposes for your neighborhood CDR. It's somebody who's employed by the government, but 80% of Cubans are employed by the government. But their job has many elements. One is to maintain detailed records on people's whereabouts, their family, their work history, their involvement in political activities, their overall revolutionary moral character for everyone in their district. So you'll see in this picture it says Número 2, Zona 23. So it's number 2 from Zone 23. The CDRs also assist in ensuring compliance with compulsory military service. So young men, when they graduate high school, are required to do 1 or 2 years of compulsory military service. And the ones who do 2 years are typically the ones who are not going to go on to university. The CDR must approve when someone wants to change their residence. So if you want to move, buy a house on the other side of the island, you have to get approval from your local CDR and then from the CDR in the neighborhood where you're going to move to. They're charged with registering the family food ration card when people move into their neighborhood. And their endorsements are required for students applying for membership at the university or in the local political groups. So CDR is a very important element of Cuban life. One great thing about the CDR is they also keep young people from becoming delinquents. They ensure that everyone stays in line with their doctor's visits, with vaccinations, and it's part of keeping life orderly in Cuba. When you talk to Cubans about it, many of them are pretty ambivalent about the CDR. It's just part of life because they've had it since the 60s in Cuba. And once in a while you'll hear a complaint, but not very often. So I have a friend that lives in Old Town Havana that I was visiting her rundown apartment one time. And she was telling me that Univision television from Miami comes in through her antenna, and she's able to see it on her antenna in her apartment. But that is something that would be against the revolution or unpatriotic to watch TV from the US. And so what she does is she turns her radio up really loud and then puts her ear right next to the TV so that she can hear the news from Miami. And she does it this way in hopes that nobody will find out and tell her CDR that she's being unpatriotic by watching TV from America. So CDR truly does have influence to keep everybody in line. Other thing to note in this picture is the soldier who's leaning against a memorial for Che Guevara. And you'll notice that he doesn't have a big machine gun on. He doesn't have a menacing presence. So when you see soldiers, security, and police officers in Cuba, they tend to be very understated. Oftentimes police officers won't even have a handgun. And guns are something that is very unusual in Cuba and very limited. And so it's very extraordinary for even a Cuban to have a gun. What's funny is you go to Cuba thinking, oh, this is a military state and we're going to be closely watched. And then it feels like there's hardly any police presence at all. And then when you fly home, going in through Miami or Fort Lauderdale Airport, um, we've often passed Miami police or Fort Lauderdale police with big semi-automatic rifles. And it's kind of a shock. Welcome back to the US where there are big menacing guns and security is a menace, it has a menacing presence. Okay, internet in Cuba is something that is changing quickly. We started our business in 2015, and at that time, less than 5% of Cubans had access to the internet. And what we've seen over the years is that more and more Cubans are getting access. And even in the last year, some Cubans are able to have access to internet in their home. But this photo is a common sight that you'll see in front of any big hotel or at a big central park in any of the cities in Cuba. You'll see young people on their phones and their laptops accessing Wi-Fi. And when they do it this way in a park, what they do is they buy a Wi-Fi card. So the way that in the 90s, we used to buy calling cards and you scratch off the number and you put in that number and that's your access. It's the same way for internet. So an access card costs about $2 for an hour of internet use. And they have different access cards for foreigners than they do for Cubans. So sometimes, especially if you go in a high tourist season, it can be hard to even find the tourist internet access card. So I always recommend you don't plan on having internet access while you're in Cuba. And if you are able to get a card and do have time to go to a plaza, consider it a treat. That being said, recently the casa, the house that we prefer to stay at when we're in Havana, they have Wi-Fi in the home, just the same way we have Wi-Fi here at our house. And so you can ask the front desk clerk if they will connect you to Wi-Fi, and they will type in the code for you so that you can have Wi-Fi even from your room. But like I said, it's unreliable, so don't plan on it. Typically, you can't post pictures or email pictures because it's super slow to download. And so what I do when I go to Cuba, because I have 3 children that I leave behind when we go, is that part of the way through the trip, I will type up a quick email on my smartphone. And then that day, if I have a chance to go connect to Wi-Fi, I'll connect, I'll press send, I'll wait for my emails to download back to my phone, and then I'll disconnect right away, and I'll read the emails later. I never bring a laptop to Cuba. I just use my smartphone. Typical housing in central Havana. You can find this kind of housing all over the countryside. On Viva Cuba tours, you will never stay in this kind of lodging, although you may stay in a neighborhood like this, because we really like for our travelers to get a sense of what life is like for average Cubans, but still be comfortable and feel safe and secure. So a good story that goes along with this one. If you look at the picture on the left with the refrigerator, this is not a picture of my friend's house. This is a photo I got off the internet. But my friend who lives in central Havana has a home like this. And she had a refrigerator from the 1960s. And so it was not energy efficient at all. So the government came through and replaced all of the refrigerators in her building with new refrigerators that were high efficiency, small, but highly energy efficient refrigerators. And then they went on to charge everybody who had a new refrigerator, $3 a month for 10 years to pay for their new refrigerator. Now, my friend works at a local community resource center. She makes about $20 a month. So this is a big portion of her salary that she's making that she has to spend on a refrigerator that she didn't even have a choice on. So that gives you a perspective of a little bit of what life is like. So in 2019, a new constitution was put into place. And the man standing in the white shirt, that's the president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, who was elected in 2018. He was the only name on the ballot. And this new constitution was just declaring Cuba a socialist yet communist, independent, prosperous, and sustainable country. In this new constitution, there was a big effort to make same-sex marriage legal. And in the end, the conservatives in the country rose up in protest, which is an unusual thing in Cuba. And the new constitution ended up leaving kind of the door open for same-sex marriage to become more easily accessible. Cuban figures estimate that the number of self-employed workers nearly tripled between 2009 and 2013. So before 2009, 80 to 90% of all Cubans were employed by their government. And in that just one period from 2009 to 2013, more and more people became entrepreneurs. Okay, let's talk about religion. If you see in your notes, there was a Miami-based polling firm in March of 2015 that did a survey of Cubans and their religious affiliations. 44% said they had no religious affiliation. 27% called themselves Catholic, and 13% of Cubans identify with Santeria. There are even smaller pockets of evangelicals, Protestants, Jehovah's Witnesses, Methodists, Jews, and Muslims. Now, that being said, I've also read statistics where 80% of Cubans say they identify with, practice some form of Santeria. So, truly, the data around religious beliefs in Cuba is unreliable at best. Now, that being said, you would expect, this is a Latin American country, that everyone is Catholic. And it was settled by the Spaniards. This is a picture of St. Christopher Cathedral in Havana. And this is the most famous cathedral in Havana, and it's on Plaza Catedral in the old historic part of Havana. This was built in the mid-1700s. And what's fascinating is that it was built from coral from the rock that's found in the nearby ocean floor. So if you look closely when you walk by, you can see marine fossils in the outer wall of the facade. It's really fascinating. In 1689, the College of San Ambrosio was founded in Havana under control of the Jesuits. So the Jesuits have had a presence for many centuries in Cuba. Okay, Santeria. So the origins of Santeria can be defined as a unique blend of traditional Yoruba beliefs, and the Yoruba were one of the big tribes of Africans that were brought over as slaves, particularly in the 1700s. And so those Yoruba beliefs are colored with the multicultural spiritual beliefs of the island of Cuba. So in an attempt to preserve their traditional religious practices, the Yoruba blended their individual Orisha cults together into one unified religion. It's also referred to as the religion of the Lukumi people. So you'll see here I've got a picture of of a statue to Oshun, a man dressed in a costume acknowledging Chango. And the Santeria religion is a very secretive religion. So in Santeria, a santo or padrino is a priest of Santeria, an Afro-Cuban religion that grew from the slave trade. For many years, teachings were only passed by word of mouth, but today literature does exist for priests who focus on the core of Santeria, which is to bond human beings with powerful but mortal spirits called orishas. An orisha is a representation of Oldumare, God, and followers believe that orishas will aid them in life if they celebrate associated rituals through dancing, speaking, singing, drumming, and eating with the spirits. In a mutually beneficial relationship, the orishas will only continue to exist with the presence of loyal worshippers. Santeria priests can be male and female and go through an intense training of various sorts, but much is dedicated to learning both traditional medicine and herbalism, as they will become valued nutritional and spiritual advisors to Cubans. Following, there is an initiation in which a priest is reborn into a spirit, making the commitment to serve one of the orishas. With this comes special powers, including the ability to predict the future. Divination is determined by the way in which a set of palm nuts or coconuts break and fall at the throw of a priest's hands. Santa Barbara is veiled Chango, who embodies justice and strength and is associated with lightning and fire. Ochun is the Yoruba goddess of the river, but long masqueraded as Our Lady of Charity. Sensual and sensitive, Ochun is represented by water, dance, the color yellow, sweets, and money, among many things. Offerings such as dead hens and fruit can be found under ceiba trees, which are considered sacred by practitioners of the Yoruba religion, and found along riverbanks and at cemeteries. So it's very common to see what would seem like a Catholic altar in a home. And then when you look closer, you see seashells, you'll see cups of water, and you'll see money laid there, and lots of yellow. And that is offering to Oshun. In the bottom left corner or right corner of the screen, you see the woman dressed all in white. And those are people that are frequently seen in Cuba who are on the road to becoming official priests or priestesses of Santeria. So the Jewish community has a presence in Cuba as well. And many Jews escaped the Holocaust between 1939 and 45 by coming to Cuba. A great example of this is if you can look up the movie Forgotten Jewels, who was made by two women in Boulder, Colorado. And it's a documentary of Jews from Belgium in the diamond industry who came to Cuba, managed to escape the Holocaust, and worked in the diamond industry until the end of the war. And then many of the Jews, when the war ended, they went to the United States. They were able to get visas. So it is fascinating, the history of Jews in Cuba. There's a story from about a decade ago, where the president of the Jewish community in Havana had a conversation with Fidel Castro. Fidel asked, "How many Jews are there in Cuba?" And the president answered, "About 1,200, Mr. President." And Fidel said, "That's it? How do you guys make so much noise?" So the community has been striving to maintain its identity and its presence in Cuba over the decades. Christianity. So Fidel Castro banned the importation and distribution of Bibles in Cuba in 1969, but now the government has lifted that ban. But consider this, that from 1969 until 1998, not even Christmas was allowed to be celebrated because there was such religious persecution in Cuba. So in 1998 was when the Pope John Paul II came to visit Cuba, and this opened the door to religious freedom for Cubans. Now, religious freedom is something that is not clearly defined. So, uh, religious freedom means that most people can practice the religion of their choice, but they cannot, for example, no new churches can be built. Just in the last 3 years has the Catholic Church received permission to build one new cathedral in all of the island of Cuba. So many of the believers in Cuba gather in home churches. There's a Chinatown in Cuba, would you have guessed? So in the 1800s, there is a significant portion of Chinese who went to Cuba as indentured servants. And so a pocket still remains in Havana of Chinese descendants. And when you walk through Chinatown, all the hosts at the restaurants will invite you in and they'll tell you, hey, we have a real Chinese cook in our restaurant. Come eat here. It's really interesting. Baseball is king in Cuba. It's been played in Cuba since the 1860s when U.S. sailors introduced the game. It was the home of winter practice for U.S. baseball teams until the Cuban Revolution. And the Industriales, which is photographed here, are kind of the most famous. They're seen as the New York Yankees of Cuba. There are about 18 Cubans that are playing in the U.S. Major leagues. Of course, they fled and they defected in order to be able to do so. Russian culture. This is the Espada de Rusia. The nickname is the Sword of Russia. And this is a photo of the Russian embassy in Havana. So from 1960 to 1991, the Soviet Union had immense influence because they were the primary trading partner with Cuba, and they were happily establishing a communist stronghold here just 90 miles from Florida. They had a large presence. So in Cuba, children were learning Russian in school, and parents were naming their children Vladimir and many other Russian-sounding names. And then you see a lot of architecture that has been influenced by Russia. It's sometimes described as it was like mixing oil and water. The two cultures never really mingled. Most Russians lived in separate compounds. They never understood the Cuban way of life. They remained so-called music deaf. They did not manage to go beyond the 1, 2, 3 of casino, which is a type of traditional Cuban dancing, or to understand what was so special about dominoes, café cortado, or even baseball. Some Russian women married Cubans and remained on the island, but modern day numbers are very low when one considers the sheer number of Russians who used to live in Cuba, or the number of Cubans who studied in Moscow, Minsk, or Novosibirsk. Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway first visited Cuba in 1932, and he spent 22 years of his life there. Of course, it was in Cuba where he wrote The Old Man and the Sea, and his fishing boat, Pilar, was docked at Cojimar, a small village east of the city of Havana. If you have the notes that accompany these slides, you'll have your full list of movies, of our favorite movies and our favorite books on Cuba. There are other books that I've read on Cuba that didn't make the list because either they weren't consistent with other research that I've done, or I found the storyline dull. Um, if you do not have the notes, you can also find these on this list on our website under the Learn link. If you want to connect with the Cuban news, there's some great online resources. You can go to www.gramma.cu, and grandma is spelled GRANMA.cu, and that's the Cuban version of the official Grandma newspaper. So it's all in Spanish. There's an English version, but what's ironic is that the stories are not consistent with the Spanish version. You can tell that it's written for more of an American audience. And the website for that link is en.grandma, that's GRANMA.cu. So that's the English version. Or you can go to the www.havanatimes.org, and that has a lot of tourist information. That is pretty interesting. Okay, what to pack? This gives you an idea of what Cubans wear. Typically, especially in Havana, most Cuban men will be in long pants and a guayabera, a button-down shirt. And this is a safe outfit to wear, or safe. It's a typical outfit to wear in the daytime or the evening. And for evening, for sure, men want to have a pair of long pants that they can wear out and a button down or at least a golf shirt. For women, there's a little more of anything goes, especially on the top. So it's pretty typical for women to wear slinky tops and jeans. And jeans are seen as kind of fancy. Notice she's wearing nice shoes. And so this is a pretty typical outfit for Havana. When you leave Havana, it's much more acceptable to be in shorts. And we recommend that women wear long shorts and men wear nice shorts, but it's pretty typical. Let's talk about travel safety. Purse snatchings and muggings are extremely rare in Cuba. So Cubans see tourists as something to be protected, and so tourists are typically very well taken care of. What I recommend is that you keep a copy of your passport on yourself at all the times. It's hot and sweaty, so sometimes it's miserable to actually have your passport on you, but that can be safely locked away in your suitcase with a suitcase lock. Be street smart. So don't count your money in public places. Everybody in Cuba knows that Americans travel with only cash and not credit cards. And ATMs are rare, and if you find one, you can only use it if your bank is a European or Canadian bank. Scammers are very common in Cuban. They're referred to as hinoteros, and if you are out walking the streets of a Cuban city by yourself, they'll quickly find you and help you find a restaurant, a dance club, show you around. They'll be warm and friendly, but it's a stranger who has no purpose for meeting you. And then after they've shown you around for a bit, they will request to be paid for their services. And they'll be demand to be paid for their services. So I recommend that if you want the help of a Cuban, you go for it. But if you're just wandering and sightseeing and taking pictures, tell them, no thanks, please leave me alone. Tell them I'm not going to pay you. Let me be. Sometimes you have to be direct after the first or second attempt at saying no. Okay, one very important thing to know is that possession of marijuana is a huge crime in Cuba. It's tough for Coloradoans, particularly where our business is based, to get our minds around this because CBD creams for arthritis are very common, and and a lot of Coloradoans use CBD or marijuana in some form for pain relief, but I ask that you truly leave those at home and don't risk getting caught with that in your possession in Cuba, because all marijuana products are seen as a huge crime. Money. So the money that Americans use in Cuba are called CUCs or CUCs. So when you change your money, you should request 5 and 10s, because if you end up with a 50 CUC bill, you're going to have a hard time spending it, because most people won't have change. On a Viva Cuba tour, we highly recommend you bring $50 a day for spending money. That will allow you to buy a meal every other day, because there are 5 meals that are not included in the tours. But it also allows you to have the freedom, if you have some rest time in the afternoon, to jump in a cab to go to another part of the city or return to a place that you wanted to take more pictures of. And most people on our tours bring home extra cash. So although I recommend taking $50 a day, so it's about $500 per person in cash, most people tell me they spent less than $200 on a tour, and that includes buying artwork and souvenirs. Very important, bring new or like new bills when you go to Cuba. A wrinkled bill, a marked bill, or a torn bill is typically not accepted, and you can't exchange it. Now, you'll read online that you should bring Canadian or euros with you to Cuba, but what they don't tell you online is that it can be difficult to change them. Cubans really want their hands on US dollars. US dollars have power. And so I would say don't bring any more than 50% of your money in euros or Canadian money. And when you first arrive in Cuba in the first day or so, I say change $100 to $200 of your money and see how far it gets you, rather than changing all of the money that you brought, because the last thing you want to do is change your money back from CUCs into dollars, because you'll lose money in the transition. Okay, so we talked about how Cubans dress. The big question that I always get is what to pack. So the picture on the far left shows you one of our tour groups from 2019. And you can see we're in Havana, and most of the men are wearing long shorts. They're dress shorts with pockets rather than athletic shorts. Everybody's wearing sensible either walking sandals or tennis shoes, because this was a day that was a lot of walking. And a lot of women are wearing capris or pants. Short sleeves, of course, a hat and sunglasses, because you're in the tropics. But aside from our July tour that is a herpetology tour, most of our tours are done when the weather's in the 70s and low 80s. And so plan to enjoy comfortable summer weather with a little bit of humidity. So in the notes that are provided to accompany this, I've got a list of what to pack for daytime and evening, and miscellaneous things to bring. Oh, so for evening, you'll see a picture there of myself and my husband, Stephen. And this is typical of how we dress in the evening. I'll wear a dress or a skirt and fun sandals, and not spiky heels, because there's very smooth sidewalks in all of Cuba. And then my husband will wear a button-down shirt. In this case, he's wearing a guayabera, and pants and dress shoes. It's kind of nice for the men to have a pair of dress shoes along, so that they can seriously dance with the women in the group. Okay, so miscellaneous things to pack. I recommend that you pack everything that you need for 10 days in a carry-on suitcase. So I've got photos on the right here of my carry-on suitcase that I take. And it's one that can be, on most airlines, you can put it in the bin above. And it's not a requirement that you don't check your bag, But if I don't check my bag, if I carry it on, then I know that everything I brought will get to Cuba with me. So there have been instances of um, people getting things stolen in before your suitcase makes it to baggage claim in Havana. So if you do check a bag, definitely lock it. The other thing is when you are changing locations often on a Viva Cuba tour, you'll stay at 4 or 5 different bed and breakfasts. And so it's nice to not have too many things because you don't want to unpack and repack every day when you're changing locations. So what I do is I bring enough outfits for 5 days, and then halfway through the trip, I wash it all, and then I rewear those outfits. Um, and because I'm on vacation, what I'll often do is on day 5, when we get to the whatever casa we're staying at that night, I'll ask the lady of the house if she has someone that could do laundry for me. And usually they're quick to jump on it and say, yes, of course, I'll do your laundry, because they have access to washing machines. So if they don't have one, they have access to one because they're washing the sheets often. And so then I'll give them my clothes and my husband's clothes to wash, and then the next day we'll have fresh, clean clothes for the rest of our trip. The other thing is sometimes you'll end up staying on a second or third floor, and so you're dragging that suitcase around, and it's nice to have it not be too heavy. So here's some tips of what to put in your suitcase. Either a small umbrella for shade and or rain, or a mini rain poncho. And I go to the camping section at Walmart and I buy 2 mini rain ponchos. They take up no room, and then I've got them if I need them. A reusable water bottle is really great. And you can see in my suitcase, there's a pink water bottle there. And that is so that everybody in the group has different water bottles. So if there's a half empty water bottle on a seat, I can identify that it's mine. And also, we tend to buy 2-gallon bottles of water that we keep on the bus so that you have unlimited clean drinking water the whole trip. And by buying the big 2-gallon bottles of water, there's a lot less plastic waste. Bring a suitcase lock. So even if you don't check your suitcase, it's nice to be able to leave your suitcase in the casa or locked underneath the bus with a lock on it so that you know nobody's going to steal anything out of it. And so I tend to leave extra money and my passport in my suitcase. One thing about it in a casa, if like mine is a soft-sided suitcase, so somebody could take a knife and cut it open and take things out of it. But if that happened, the casa owner would likely lose their license, their business, and their livelihood. So casa owners are very careful to be protective with tourist belongings. We've never had problems. Bring a flashlight and extra batteries. Don't ever expect to be able to buy batteries in Cuba. Bring extra batteries for your camera if you need them. I don't bring a flashlight because I use the flashlight app on my phone. Bring your alarm clock or a cell phone with an alarm. Bring sunblock and mosquito repellent. And when you leave Havana, you're going to want your mosquito repellent. Mosquitoes I hardly ever get bit by mosquitoes when I'm in Havana, but when you go out into the countryside, they're much more prevalent. Bring a small day pack or just a drawstring bag to be able to toss your camera and your water bottle in when you're wandering around the city. Bring a swimsuit, a small towel. I actually bring just an old hand towel with me for when we have a chance to take a dip in the ocean. And I bring flip-flops for wearing in the house, but I also bring hiking sandals because some of the areas where we're on the coast, instead of being nice, soft, sandy beach, some areas are super sharp coral. And so that enables you to get in and out of the water without cutting your feet up. So I bring hiking sandals for that. Bring your own bar of soap because some casas will forget to put out soap for you. Bring a hair dryer. Sometimes those are not accessible. And you don't need to worry about converters because in Cuba, everything has 110 access like we do in the US. And I recommend wearing clothing that you would like to donate at the end of the trip. So maybe your summer clothes that you are tired of wearing, and you can wear them 2 more times in Cuba, and at the end of the trip, you can leave them behind. Clothing is something that is hard for Cubans to get, and they really appreciate it. I bring a small inflatable travel pillow because you never know what the quality of the pillow is going to be in your room. And some days you'll have a couple hours in a row of riding on a bus, and so it's nice to be able to grab a nap. Gifts. I recommend that you never give out gifts on the street because in the Cuban tourist industry, we are really trying to prevent creating a culture of beggars. And Cubans see it as a real insult when Cuban children come up and beg tourists for things. So give them to people that you meet, whether it be an artist, it be a special waiter at a restaurant, or the casa owners. So great gifts are travel-sized lotions and soaps, art supplies, musical instruments, and especially Cuban trace guitar strings. So you go on Amazon and look up Cuban trace, and it's TRES, guitar strings. And if you those are something that's very difficult to find in Cuba, that's unusual for tourists to know to bring, but very prized. Baseballs and baseball gloves, aspirin, sanitary items, Band-Aids, toothbrushes and toothpaste. Colgate toothpaste is very popular, very hard to find in Cuba. School supplies, USB sticks are very valued as well. So in closing, pack light, don't overdo it. Pack for summer weather, but be sure you bring some nice outfits for the evenings because Cuba culture is a little more formal, and there are many restaurants you won't even be able to go to at night if you are wearing shorts. And enjoy your trip to Cuba. Don't let the packing or bringing gifts overshadow just the full experience of being in Cuba. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope that you like and subscribe. And we've got other videos from the Curious About Cuba class that you can watch and learn more.